This is Lecture 18, The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. Something that most of you are familiar with. I know it's part of 8th grade curriculum. The blue versus the gray. The blue being the Union, the North. The gray was typically the uniform of the South, the Confederate States of America. You see the flags. You see the fact that it was a war within America, Americans against Americans, brother against brother. And there's always a debate of how much of it was about states' rights, slavery, um, political power. We gave you the background, how we got to the American Civil War. And in AP, it does not focus a lot in actual war and conflict. It's more on how wars impact America politically, economically, and socially. And of course, this one had a huge impact during and after. Abraham Lincoln, as he became president, vowed to preserve the Union. He felt that was his responsibility to keep the nation together. He said that in his inaugural address. He vowed to preserve the Union. The way that it transpired was at this fort in South Carolina, a federal fort, Fort Sumter, 1861. Being in South Carolina, the Confederacy just assumed that the federal government would not try to keep this fort. Lincoln, on the other hand, again, wanting to preserve the Union and wanting to retain everything that belonged to the federal government, sent resources, sent supplies to the fort when the South had warned him not to. As the Union sent supplies, including weapons, to the fort in 1861, the Confederates fired upon the Union troops there, which the Union had to surrender the fort, but now they had a reason to declare war. They had a reason to now, using military conflict, preserve the Union. So the attack on Fort Sumter is the event that sparked the war. Now, it's important, Lincoln, his leadership during the Civil War is what's made him so popular. There's a lot of political moves that he had to do. And some of it had to do with the border slave states. There were some states that kept their slaves that stayed with the Union, that stayed with the North. The map over here to the right, these areas right here with the striped red and blue, those were the border slave states, stayed with the Union. Now, Lincoln was very careful not to alienate them, not to do something that would push them to the Confederacy, as we'll get into. But again, a lot of political decisions he made, controversial, how he treated the border states, and how he took on the issue of slavery. Because he did not, in the beginning of this war, call for the complete emancipation of slaves. He wanted to preserve the Union. Now, like other presidents have done throughout American history, the presidents sometimes ignore the Constitution and take huge power and put it on their shoulders. And this is a controversy of Lincoln during the war. For example, to prevent traitors, spying, espionage, and spying, he would restrict civil liberties during the war. Now, in restricting civil liberties, that means taking away some people's basic rights out of fear that it could hurt the war effort. So, once again, Americans would be denied freedom of speech to some degree, especially if the president thought it hurt the war effort. So he restricted civil liberties. And some examples of how he restricted civil liberties: in the border state of Maryland, he actually declared martial law. Under martial law, you're literally calling it a war zone, and the military has total control. Your constitutional rights are ignored. The military does what's necessary to keep peace. And overall, in the Union, he suspended the right of habeas corpus. This means your right to a hearing if you're accused of a crime. He suspended that right during the war. If he thought someone was being a traitor or helping the enemy, by suspending the right of habeas corpus, some Americans were detained, put in jails for a long time before they had any constitutional hearing, any type of trial. Lincoln felt this was necessary during the time of war. Now, in fighting the war, there was advantages and disadvantages to both sides. When it came to resources, money, the North had a huge advantage. The North had the factories and the railroads. The railroads were a huge advantage because you could move goods and armies. But the North was also more diverse. The North could grow food. The North had, again, the factories and industry and trade above all else. That was a huge advantage they had over the South. The Southern advantage is they believed they were fighting for a worthy cause, their freedom, their liberty, their rights to their own government. They knew, like in the American Revolution, they just had to fight to a draw, to a tie, until the North no longer wanted to fight. The South also had superior military leaders, as we're going to find out. So these are some of the advantages and disadvantages. Now, European diplomacy entering the war is important. One of the reasons why the South believed they could win this conflict is because they had a close relationship to England. They sold a lot of cotton to England. And they were at some point expecting the British to protect them, to help them in the fight against the Union. In the Trent Affair in 1861, the Union armies captured the boat named the Trent, in which there were English diplomats on board. Well, Lincoln quickly freed those English diplomats out of fear that the British would help the South. So this was an example of the Trent Affair was an example of Lincoln not doing anything that could cause the British to go against the Union. Again, the Trent was a ship with Confederate leaders in it that the Union captured, but that the American soldiers, the Union, quickly freed the British diplomats. When it came to raising armies, there were huge volunteers, especially in the South, and some in the North, but both had to use federal conscription law in 1863. Conscription means the draft. Well, the Union passed a federal conscription law in 1863 to get enough troops, and the Confederates did it throughout, but not in a federal law like this. So this was a Union federal conscription law passed in 1863. But the draft would cause a problem. As an example of the problem that it caused, in 1863 in New York City, there was a huge draft riot. Poor immigrants were protesting the draft, especially Irish immigrants. In 1863, they started a huge riot. Again, a lot of Irish immigrants against the draft. They attacked African Americans who they blamed for the war. They attacked federal officials that were using the draft, organizing the draft in the North. It was a very ugly sight because there was a lot of problems with the draft as well. Like the wealthy could escape the draft. They could buy their way out of it. So the poor immigrants felt they were unfairly targeted. When it came to African Americans, a lot of free African Americans were quick to join the military. However, the Union was very cautious in allowing them into the military. And when they did, at first they would not allow them into battle. They feared them with weapons in their hands. But finally, an all African American regiment was allowed to fight in battles. The 54th Massachusetts, all African American unit was allowed to fight, take military action. And their bravery, their courage, led to the Union recruiting more African Americans into the military ranks. Here we have a picture of the memorial of the 54th Massachusetts. You can find this in Boston. The Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, the white colonel, led by the African American troops. Here is the 54th Massachusetts when they fought at a fort in the South. And up here's the picture of the infamous New York Draft Riot, 1863. Now, during the war, and remember, this is the beginning of Lincoln's presidency, he set forth economic policies that would be very, very successful. We give Lincoln a lot of credit for his leadership during the war, for the decisions he made, and, for freeing the slaves. We never talk enough about his economic policies, and they were highly effective. He should be remembered for his excellent economic policies, the right decisions that he made there. To win the war, of course, you have to raise revenue. You have to raise money to win the war. So this is the approach that he took through the federal government. He passed the first federal income tax, based on the money that one makes. So he increased for the first time, passed the first federal income tax to raise revenue for the war, as we can see over here on the right-hand side. He initiated new excise taxes like the ones on whiskey. Excise tax on goods that are considered like luxuries. He raised the tariff. So if you're paying for goods that are coming in from other countries, it was called the Morrill Tariff Act. He raised the tariff on import goods. Again, all of this designed to raise more revenue to get the weapons and the food and the resources for win the war. Like all wars, the federal government sold war bonds. There's an example of a military bond right up here, which are like these temporary loans that citizens gave to the federal government at a time of war. He brought back the national banking system to try to stabilize the banking industry in America, and he created the first federal currency. They were called greenbacks. Here's an example of one over to the right, which would be a foundation for today's modern day dollars. These were all decisions, of course, not alone, he makes with advisors to make money to win the war and have a stable economy for this lengthy war. Greenbacks are first currency. Now, remember, this is the era of industrialization still, and we also have this land to the west. So he also thought it was important to continue to develop the land out west because it would only help our economy. He got Congress to pass the Homestead Act of 1862. In the Homestead Act of 1862, the federal government was almost giving away plots of land to Americans that were bold enough to go out west. They paid a modest fee and they promised to develop the land. And by 1865, 20,000 settlers had moved out west. And of course, in very risky, dangerous situations, plotting their own land out west. These are pictures right here of the first homesteaders. Had to deal with the conditions, natives out living in the West. But this helped Americans to expand, of course, increase our farming industry and so forth. Similar to the Homestead Act of 1862, the Morrill Land Grant Act. Through the Morrill Land Grant Act, the federal government gave state governments land to sell. Under the Morrill Land Grant Act, the federal government gave state governments land to sell, land that they could sell to individuals out west. federal land for the states to sell to their citizens. But in return, with the money from selling that land, with the revenue from selling that land, the states were required to use that money to build colleges and universities to benefit the education of their people. So again, the federal government gave states land to sell. That was a Morrill Land Grant Act. But in return, those states had to invest that money into making colleges and universities. And if you look at the map to the right, you'll see a number of universities that were paid for through the Morrill Land Grant Act. And this helps an economy. This helps Americans to get skills in an industrialized world. Another important law in terms of westward expansion and continued economic growth, the Pacific Railway Act of 1862. This was passed. The intention of this was to make a railroad to connect the east all the way to the west, to create a continental railroad. And of course, when that is built, it won't be built after the war. It's really going to open up the West to American expansion, trade, agriculture, mining, cattle industry. I can't say enough how these economic policies really helped to make America an even wealthier nation. Unfortunately, Lincoln would not get to see the end result of all of this, but he needs to be given a lot of credit for his economic policies, not only to raise money to win the war, but westward expansion and continued economic growth. The war itself, like I said, the battles and so forth are interesting. The leaders, etc., the decisions that were made in the Civil War, very interesting. But in AP, again, we look at the politics, the economics, the social developments, etc. So I'm just going to touch on a few of the generals and the events that took place. Robert E. Lee, here's a picture of him to the right. He would be the commanding general of the Confederate Army, and considered by many the best general of this conflict. The first battle that took place was in 1861, the Battle of Bull Run, the first major battle of the war. It was a battle that the Union was confident that they would win, but they were defeated. They were defeated handily by Robert E. Lee's best general, his wingman, General Stonewall Jackson. And when we talk about Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, again, some of the reasons why, historians argue that the Confederates had the best military leaders during the American Civil War. The other impact of the Battle of Bull Run is that both sides realized after that battle this war would take a long time to decide. This was going to be a challenge for both sides. When it came to Union strategy, how to defeat the South, because remember, for the most part, it had to be a war in which they invaded the South, the Union would begin with an Anaconda Plan. They called it the Anaconda Plan, to squeeze out. There's a picture over here to the right being an anaconda. To create a blockade of the southern states. A naval blockade to prevent their trade, to hurt them, to impact them economically, to force them to end the war sooner than later. Now, the Union Army, Lincoln had a hard time finding someone like Robert E. Lee. He would go through a few commanding generals, but in the end, he felt they were very ineffective, and he kept firing his Union generals until Ulysses S. Grant comes along. So in the first year of the war, it did not look good for the Union. The Union could not use their resources effectively because of their poor military decisions. The first major victory came in Antietam, 1862. This was an attempt by Robert E. Lee to get a victory in the North. his intention by getting a victory in the North was to convince England to join the South, to join the Confederacy, to convince Great Britain to join the Confederacy. And this is why it's called the most important, and many times the important battle of the war, because it would be the Union victory that Lincoln needed at a time when they were losing. Lincoln used the opportunity of the victory at Antietam to issue his Emancipation Proclamation. An interesting order, an interesting directive by Abraham Lincoln. Under the Emancipation Proclamation, he freed the slaves. Here's the catch. He freed all the slaves in the states that were in rebellion. Do you understand the catch? I said this earlier. There were some slave states that remained with the Union, the border states. The Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to them. This is what Lincoln was criticized for by abolitionists, the hypocrisy of it. He freed the slaves in the states that were in rebellion, but not the border states that he did not want to alienate. The specific law that allowed the federal government to free the states was the Confiscation Act. So as the North invaded the South, like they can acquire property, like the property becomes theirs, the Confiscation Act really allowed the federal government to free the slaves in the South as they invaded. The second major victory, and probably the defining moment, the beginning of the end for the Southern forces, was the Battle of Gettysburg. It was another attempt, probably the last attempt, that Robert E. Lee had in trying to get a major victory. This one was in Pennsylvania on Union soil in 1863. As the war had already dragged on here between 2 and 3 years, and it was difficult, especially for the South, in terms of resources. And I can't say enough that these battles, and there's various battles, I'm just giving you the bigger ones, were just bloodbath. They were terrible. We're talking thousands of troops dying, and it's not even, a situation where it's both sides. Thousands of Americans, because both sides are Americans. Thousands of troops on afternoons and over days of bloody deaths. Abraham Lincoln took advantage of the victory at Gettysburg to give his famous Gettysburg Address, a speech that reaffirmed the Union's goal in all of this was to live according to the Constitution, live according to the Declaration of Independence, live according to freedom of everyone and equality. Well, the best thing following the Battle of Gettysburg that Lincoln could do is then find the general that could finish the job. Following the Gettysburg Address, he appointed Ulysses S. Grant as a commander of the Union forces. And he would be the final commander that he would hire that ultimately would lead to the Union victory. Now, towards the end of the war, with about a year left, there's a political election taking place. And everything isn't perfect in the Union. There are some that want to negotiate with the Confederacy and give them their freedom. Some Northern Democrats that are sympathetic to the Confederacy that are saying it's not worth it, let them go. Now, this group of Democrats that wanted peace with the Confederacy, they were called Copperheads by those politicians that supported the war, by the Republicans and the Northern Democrats that supported ending the war, that supported a Union victory. They called the Northern Democrats that wanted a peace, that wanted to end the war, they referred to them as copperheads. And that's an insult because a copperhead is a poisonous snake from the South. And that's what this picture is referring to here. So in the election of 1864, the Democrats actually nominated George McClellan, one of the generals that Lincoln fired. And for this election, there was a temporary Union Party put together. The Union Party was Republicans and Democrats that wanted the Union to win the war. The Union Party was put together to support the election once again of Abraham Lincoln. And because Abraham Lincoln, and here's his campaign poster over here, and really because we were winning the war, it was close to the end, Abraham Lincoln was reelected. And when Abraham Lincoln got reelected, all hopes of the Confederacy, and they tried to negotiate an end to peace, but those hopes ended when he won re-election. The final surrender came in 1865. Picture to the right, see Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant, as the North effectively really invaded the South and started to break them apart. The final surrender came at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia of 1865. Tragically, only 5 days after the surrender, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a Southern sympathizer, someone angry at the president and what took place. There's a picture down here was he went with his wife to the theater. John Wilkes Booth snuck in and shot him in the head from behind. Again in 1865, 5 days after the surrender. Some results of this war, again, just massive losses for America. This is such, when you think of the war, it's fascinating, but at the same time, it's so very tragic part of American history. 620,000 estimated soldiers died. We had not lost that many soldiers in any war, not even close. When you talk about the beautiful, some of the beautiful cities and architecture, the plantation homes in the South that were torched to the ground, the displaced families, the questions of the former slaves that were barely surviving before and now literally became war refugees. The animosity that's going to be there for a long time between the North and the South. The Union, the nation, however, was preserved. That's a positive. The other positive was that war economy, Lincoln's economic plan, wasn't just successful in winning the war, it caused a second industrial revolution. That war economy is going to spark us, is going to elevate us to one of the wealthiest nations in the world. Although we're going to have a lot to fix between the North and the South. Two important themes, and I said it before: politics, economics, social developments. To what extent was it necessary for Lincoln to restrict civil liberties to win the war? So the examples of him restricting civil liberties and a claim whether they're necessary to some degree. The second one, I'm sorry, it has a 3 here, should be a 2. To what extent were the economic policies of Lincoln successful, and how were they successful?